session. We are on Unit 4 of our Public Organizational Design and Development under the title or the topic, Principles and Processes for Initiating, Implementing, and Managing Change. This is a very, very big topic that we ought to understand in a very, very candid way. So here is that principles are foundational rules or standards and norms that are set to guide how change ought to be initiated, implemented, and managed. So for us to be able to do that, there are processes that must be followed so that the change that we want does not affect us negatively So every organization from time to time needs to go through the process of change, because if change is not introduced, then the organization will be stuck with one thing. For example, you can go as back as 1994 or before that, where the South African government was still under the apartheid regime, where everything was nationalized. Policy making was the work of the national government, the allocation of resources, and so forth. So you see that that was how the government worked back then. So when the democratic dispensation was announced or proclaimed in 1994, you begin to see change taking place. You begin to see your national government delegating some of its management functions to the provincial government as well as the local government. So that was a big change that the South African public sector has ever experienced in years. So, but again, if you look at how management functions were delegated to certain government departments and institutions or organizations, your question should be, were these organizations really prepared to actually initiate, implement, and manage change? Because you must understand that we're coming from a background that was mainly dominated by the old and traditional public administration that focused much on centralization. So what you see is that most government departments were still caught up with the Max Weber bureaucratic theory or practices, whereby each and every organization in the public sector had a very strong hierarchy of authority, whereby it was the top management that decided for the middle and the lower management. So that is something that hinders the people that actually deal with change to be part of the decision-making processes. So those are some of the things that this unit will be focusing on. So I want you to look at your manual. I want you to research, do your own research to understand the principles and processes for initiating and implementing and managing change. So let's go on to the learning outcome. So why do we always have to look at our learning outcomes? Is because if we don't, we are not going to be guided as to what is it that we must focus on, or what is it that we aim to achieve at the end of the unit. So the learning outcomes normally is provided for one purpose, and that is to make the student aware of what would be the success, or what is it that the unit is trying to achieve at the end of the day. So here it says that by the end of this unit, you should be able to describe the principles and processes for initiating, implementing, and managing change in public organization. Now, sometimes when you talk about ways like initiating, implementing, and managing change, It might seem simple, but one thing that you must understand is that for change to take place, leadership needs to be present, because initiating change takes leadership or strong leadership. And then implementing it takes honest leadership, because there are so many projects that have been initiated for the past 10 years, but the implementation part has not been done. Or even if it was done or it were done, the problem is managing the process of implementing change has become a problem, because you must understand that for you to actually achieve effective implementation, you must be able to use resources and manage resources in a sense that you look at what your South African Constitution says in Section 195, where it says that in public administration, there must be efficient, economic, and effective use of government resources. So that tells you that you must be so careful in terms of how you manage resources while you're trying to carry out your change within those organizations. Now, you look at um, learning outcome number 2, it says you should be able to identify the principles that guide change effort through the change transition. What that simply means is that at the end of the day, change, first, it must be effortless desire, meaning that the organization must be willing to effect change through its organizational structure, because that's where it starts with public organizations. Again, you must be able to examine the role of enablers of organization change. You should be able to mention key stakeholders to be consulted during the restructuring process, identify the key reasons why people resist change, and you should be able to distinguish between 3 types of change: developmental, transitional, and transformational. So these are very, very important. I think for any unit that we cover, for you to know what to focus on, look at the learning outcomes. What is it that you must know within that unit? Because the learning outcome helps you to understand the whole purpose of the unit, so that you know that you're supposed to focus on such. Again, you must be able to describe the classic skills for successful change leaders and comprehend the reason for organizational change failure. So these are the learning outcomes that you must be able to um, understand, and you must be able to answer or perform or actually be able to attend to each and every learning outcome that we show here. So that's how important it is. So when we introduce learning to this unit, the goal here is that we want you to understand that there's multiple publications that have been done over the past 10 years that handles or that has a lot of literature on the topic of change, because change is an everlasting present element that affects all organizations, either in the private or the public sector. So your goal is to understand how change takes place in the private sector versus the public sector, because there must be a clear consensus whereby the pace of change has never been greater than in the current continuously ever evolving political, economic, cultural, religious, social, and technological environment. As for technological environment, that is the biggest one, because you will understand that from the 1990s, actually from the 1970s, we began to see change in most organizations where they wanted to move most of their manual paper-based systems to actually adopt the technological environment, where you see your internet being introduced, you see your electronics, whereby you get introduced to electronic government or e-government, and you see all these things taking place around the 1990s up until today. So today, the issue is that we are on the um, fifth let me just say, the fifth wave of our technological innovation. So the fourth industrial revolution is still important, but now we're on the fifth revolution, or industrial revolution. So that is what is happening now, is that since we've been dealing with digital technologies in the fourth industrial revolution, now is that how do you ensure trust, privacy, and security within that world of technology? Because at the end of the day, you need to be able to understand, how do you trust the information that is being provided by AI, artificial intelligence? Can you trust the information you find online? And can you really, really trust the organizations that have been advertised online? And what um, which internet website, or which Google search, or which search engines are very, very reliable in terms of finding out whether a particular organization does exist or not? Because you must also understand, for example, now we've been dealing with certain colleges that have been deregistered by the Department of Higher Education. Now, someone might not know that in the next 5 years, or in the next 2, 3 years, and they continue to register with such colleges. So, with search engines within the digital world, that can actually be so sure that they are reliable to find the correct and honest information. So those are some of the change that we're dealing with today. So the successful management of change is a highly required skill, meaning to say that in each and every public organization, your management, or your workforce, must be so skilled and ready to actually accept or adapt to change. So we look at the two authors here. They argue that the management of public organization change currently tends to be reactive, discontinuous, and ad hoc, with reported failure rate of around 70% of all change programs initiated. So that's a very, very huge number, because if they say that about 70% of any programs, or any change programs initiated, fail, that suggests automatically that at least 80 or less than 30% of change programs get to be implemented successfully. That's a very, very serious claim, because at the end of the day, you look at 70% being the failure. That's very, very bad for our public organization, because if we claim to be in the digital era, we need to be able to deal with things that can help us improve faster. So those are some things that the unit is trying to cover here. So there are certain concepts that you must understand within Unit 4. Number one being change. So you must be able to understand or define what change is, because sometimes we just talk about change. So change involves the crystallization of new action possibilities. That includes new policies, new behaviors, new patterns, new methodologies, new products, or new market ideas based on reconceptualized patterns in the organization. So what they're trying to say here is that new policies simply means that they were old policies. New behaviors simply means they were old behaviors. New patterns simply means they were old patterns. New methodologies simply means that they were new, they were old methods. And new product means that they were old products, and so forth and so forth. So for us to be able to repackage our ideas, we need to know what is the current desires and the needs of the community at large. Very, very important to understand. And then another concept is management, because you must understand that management refers to the exercising direction of a group or organization through executive, administrative, supervisory positions. Again, management responsibilities usually has to do with task orientated, and it involves developing staff, mentoring persons with high potential, and resolving conflict while maintaining ethics and discipline. I think this definition is very, very important because one of the values and principles of public administration is that within the public sector, there must be good human resource management and career development. That must be, I mean, to maximize human potential, and that has to be done, or let me just say, it must be cultivated. In other words, you need to have a very, very educated, skilled, and equipped personnel or staff, because that way it says involves developing staff means that you must be able to allow them to further their education, training, and equip them with new skills so that they learn what is currently the most required skill. And then you look at change management. Change management refers to the process of continually renewing an organization direction, structure, and capabilities to serve the ever-changing needs of external and internal customers. So what actually means here is that needs, or the external and internal needs of customers, may change based on your political, technological, social, cultural environments, because if you're not able to manage change, change will manage you as an organization, and that's something that you do not want, because at the end of the day, you must be able to manage and control how your organization is to respond to the current changes. Very, very important. Now, we also have planned organizational change or organization change. So that means is a change intervention that alters key organizational target variables that then impact individual organizational members and their on-the-job behaviors, resulting in changes in organizational outcome. So what this simply means is that change brings about change, if that will make sense. In other words, it brings change not just for the people outside the organization, but even the structure of the organization itself has to change so that it can be fit to respond to the current changes or the current needs of your customers. And for you to be able to respond well to customers due to issues of change, you must be able to study them and understand how did their needs change along the way, and not look at it as something that you're going to fight against, but adapt into it and see how best your organization can deal with change. And then there's leadership. Leadership is the process of influencing others to understand and agree about what needs to be done and how it can be done effectively. And the process of facilitating individual and collective efforts to accomplish the shared objectives. Very, very important. So that takes us to change leadership. Change leadership refers to a set of principles, techniques, or activities applied to the human aspect of executing change to influence intrinsic acceptance while reducing resistance. So leadership can change direction because as we live in a very, very ever changing environment or society, one thing that you must understand, you cannot lead the way you used to lead in 1950s, because now you're dealing with a different generation. But one thing about leadership here is just that your set of principles and laws must not change, but the way you are you respond to the environment may change. Very, very important to understand. Now, the principles of initiating change here, in our public organization or in our state, what we look at is that it must be based on your constitutional and legislative frameworks. So why do we say that? Is because the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa of 1996, we refer to it as the supreme law of the country, where it provides us with democratic values and principles that should or that should serve as a guide for the whole South African public administration or public sector or public service. So we find this that the foundational principles in section 195 subsection 1. So these are the values that you cannot not know. You cannot afford not to know them as a public administration student. You must know them. So here there are 9, but I've seen that they've added some in, especially when you check the the pamphlet that has been um, um, printed by the Public Service Commission. But that's something for another day. But for us, when you want to look at them, you go to chapter 10, section 195. You'll find that the principles that you must understand first, number 1 is that public administration must be governed by democratic values and values enshrined in the Constitution. So this include number 1, a high standard of professional ethics must be promoted and be maintained. So what that means is that professionalism must be the key that guides how public administration ought to be structured and how it is to be managed. So again, in the process of that, you go to number 2, you look at the issues of efficient, economic, and effective use of resources must be promoted. One thing that the government is struggling to do right now is the management of its resources. There have been a lot of cases whereby most scholars and news reporters claim that there's high corruption in government, and that is a very, very serious thing because corruption robs us of effective use of resources. Everybody's trying to have their piece from the resources that's supposed to serve the society or the country. Very, very dangerous motive there coming from the people that were elected to actually use resources to benefit the whole society of South Africa. Number 3, look at public administration must be development orientated. Like what we're trying to say here is that it has to change from time to time, because if it remains at the same pace, it might fail to actually address your digital technological issues. That is why these days we're dealing with digital governance, whereby government doesn't necessarily have to govern using old and traditional methods. They can also use technology at their own advantage to actually improve governance and actually regulate some businesses and how society is supposed to function and how people are supposed to live and interact through the digital world, because that's the world that currently most people are being attuned to. Very, very important to understand. Now, again, number 4, you look at services must be provided impartially, fairly, equitably, and without bias. So what we say here is that you do not look at the skin or the color or the status or the status of a human being or a public or let me just say your customers, because at the end of the day you should not choose how you provide services either to an African or an Ethiopian or European. Provide them with services the way they're supposed to be provided. You don't do them a favor. I remember talking to one of the colleagues saying that when you work in government, make sure that whatever service that you provide to your customers or to the public, you do not feel like you're doing them a favor. In other words, there's this tendency of people working in government thinking that they're doing people a favor by saving them. But the mere fact that they're in that position signifies that they're supposed to serve the public, the community. That's why they're called public servants. So being a public servant means that you serve the public. So in most cases, public servants are trying to reverse that, as if the public is supposed to serve the servant, which does not make sense. Now you go to number 5, you look at people's needs must be responded to and the public must be encouraged to participate in policy making. Very, very important, because change takes place when people are being informed and encouraged to actually participate in policy making. So when you see your government not wanting you to participate in policy making, they are afraid of change, because when you come, you realize that some of the things that are being planned is not what the community really, really needs. So you're going to bring about change, which is what we want. And then public administration must be accountable. One of the leg aspect in government is this part, accountability. You find that officials make decisions and they get entangled with politicians, or let me just say government administrators. They find themselves entangled with the issues or with matters of politicians and vice versa. So you find that maybe the issue of being held accountable is normally not taken seriously. So because there's a very serious close relationship, if I may say, between the two spheres, and then people begin to just kind of ignore the importance of accountability in government. So these are some of the principles that you must know as a public administration student. I'm not going to go through them because of time. But another act that you must look at is the Public Service Act. Those that are working in government will realize that the Public Service Act is a very, very important piece of legislation, because this is how this is one of the pieces of legislation that helps us to actually appoint people into the public service. And then it also helps us to know the role of your minister of DPSA. So the DPSA actually set norms and standards on how the public service ought to regulate and appoint officials. They also set um, the remuneration of certain staff from level 1 to level 14 based on the kind of level that a certain employee will be employed in. So, for example, if you appoint someone on contract, I've heard that now when you appoint an HOD of a department, it's no longer 3 years. You give them at least 5 years so that they deal with that issue, because one of the reports did come back and it was suggested that if you hire them based on a 3-year contract, most HODs or directors or director generals, they spend at least 3 years trying to become familiar with the environment. And by the time they try to understand, we find that their contract ends. So at least 5 years. In other words, you see the power of the new public management. It has brought about that change, because back then it was just 3 years. So the Public Service Act is one of those legislative framework that guides a lot of responsibilities that the public service has to understand. Again, we also have the Public Service Regulations of 2016. You also know issues of service condition for those that maybe want to vacate the public service. There are people that work with service conditions whereby they will deal with your long service or termination of your 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 employment and so forth. Those are some of the things that your Public Service Act helps with. So there's a lot that you can learn. Sometimes horizontal transfer between departments. Someone working from a single or different government department and they want to move from there to another department, or maybe it's within the same government department and they want to move from one province to another, but within the same government department. So there's this thing called horizontal transfer, but according to the act, it does not just happen. It must be in a case where you want to move, there's also a position that is vacant so that they can be able to accommodate you. So you move with your salary packages and so forth. So very, very important to understand. Now this change works effectively based on 3 levels. So there's what we call change takes place more effective when worked at 3 levels. You see the organizational team, individual leader, and employees. So this is the diagram that can help you to understand that change begins with the organization. So the organization must define and communicate organizational vision and strategy, and then must be able to build commitment to organizational vision and strategy, ensure reward and recognition structures align with intended goals and objectives. So those are some of the things. Again, there must be a team that can be able to translate strategic organizational goals to team responsibilities, meaning your set goals must now be turned into responsibility that will be shared amongst team members to build a high performing team, address the impact of the changes to work and how the team is going to handle it. So individual leader. This is the guy that must clarify roles and responsibilities to employees and also address me issues, that is employee issues. And if they're doing well, reward them, reinforce inherent desire, behaviors, and values. Because at the end of the day, you want to see people not being resistant to change. So it's the work. So you go through that to connect to individual benefits or organizational results. So change is adopted by connecting individual beliefs to organizational results. This means that beliefs are the key to the world that works so that individuals can accept change. So for that individual, the belief is a cognitive fact, meaning that the change that you're going to introduce must be something that becomes not just uh, words, but it must become the belief of your employees to say that we want to change. We believe that we can change our organization. So those are some of the things that when you talk about connecting individual belief to organizational results are all about. So you need to read this in more detail from your guide. Now, there's also what we call planned and disciplined implementation cascade. So what we mean here is that change requires a planned and disciplined implementation cascade, meaning that it must come from the top management, middle management, lower management, so that planning change is like planning a journey because you are going with everyone that is within that government department. So you want to involve them in every step so that they make decisions with you and they can also help you correct some things that you do not know. Because, like it or not, the top management does not necessarily get involved in operational activities, and those that work at the lower management, they know how the organization functions better than those that are at top positions because most of them they're always traveling, like your director generals or directors, HODs are people that are always busy. So they need to hear from the lower management as to what are the current needs of the organization so that they can be able to plan ahead and together. But some organization they use the top to bottom approach whereby the bottom part don't say anything. They hear from the top what is it that they need to be doing or what kind of change is to be implemented. So go through this to understand what I'm saying here. So again, equipping leaders with to lead through transition. So there are very few practices or leadership practices that comes from the exemplary leadership theory. Uh, there are five. So as a leader, if you want to see change within your organization, you must um, model the way or modeling the way. You must inspire shared vision, challenging the process, enabling others to act, and encouraging the heart. So the first one simply means that you must begin, you must initiate the kind of change you want. And just because there's change that you want, you must be able to design a vision so clearly that people get to understand where you want to go or how you want to get there. And then challenge the process, meaning that begin with the process so that you can encourage others, enable them by giving them something to believe in terms of that change, because the vision gives you direction. A vision must be able to, you know, give you some sense of priority so that you can begin to organize and be able to instruct yourself as an organization to actually initiate, implement, and manage that change that you want. So there are frequent and ongoing communication and calibration that you need to understand. So when you're busy with your change, there are a few questions that you must uh, think about, because one thing that comes to mind is that you must be able to communicate your change or your vision to the right people. And the question that you must ask yourself are as follows: who should be consulted? Very, very important. Obviously, you need to consult the whole organization. And then what outcomes do you want from the consultation? Meaning that what is it that you want to see? Or what are the results that you expect? Or what would you when would you consult them? Very, very important to have a time frame as to how long you have till you can actually initiate change. And then what format will the consultation takes? Maybe you want to use face-to-face interviews, maybe groups or group focus areas interviews, or maybe you want to use questionnaires. Whatever it is that you find it suit for you, you can use it to actually come up or to actually hear the answers of your stakeholders. So what documentation do you need for consultation? That will come from you. What is it that you're going to prepare, and how are you going to prepare it? And either you're going to use a questionnaire, for example, and you're going to support it with the relevant um, legal frameworks that will support your kind of change. If it's a very, very serious change within the public organization, very, very important to understand. So when you want to examine change, there are few steps or few examples that you must be able to follow. Number one, a stated vision and goals for the change, for the change direction. Like I said, your vision must be so clear in a way that it provides the kind of direction that you are trying to come up with or trying to lead or trying to show your organization. And you must be able to define roles of employees involved in change, meaning that not everyone can be able to handle change and not everyone can be able to become part of your team. So you must be able to and appoint them based on ability, objectivity, as well as their skills and experience in terms of how will they fit in that change program. Because remember, one of the stats that we just dealt with here is that out of 100% of all programs that are being initiated across the world, at least less than 30% of them normally get to the finish line, meaning that 70% or more fails dismally at the initiating or initial stage. Very, very important. Now, the ways where you need to overcome resistance to change, because one of the things that you understand, especially within public administration, is that we're still dealing with traditionalist people that still are caught up in tradition, and these people work in higher offices and they don't want things to change. They still want things to remain the same. So these people will bring the risk of change, meaning that they will see that, in other words, the risk of change will be seen as a greater risk than that of standing still. So in other words, they don't see uh, standing still being a risk. They see it as a benefit. And then individuals feel connected to others when to other people who are identified with the old way. In other words, people don't want to change. They want the old ways sometimes, every time. You know, the old ways can be good if we're talking about matters of principles and methods sometimes. But sometimes you must understand that you must blend in, especially when you are in business, because some of the ways that you may use or you've been using might not work. People have no role model for the new activity. And this is because people don't want to break away from the norm. So they don't want to divorce from traditional ways of doing things. So very, very important to understand. So you must know these uh, overcoming resistance to change examples. Now, developmental, transitional, and transformational change. Remember, we talked about this as one of the learning outcomes that we're going to be looking at. So you need to understand what is developmental change. Change that can either be planned or it can be imagined, meaning that it can just emerge. Transitional change. So I need you to read on these ones because there's a lot of information in your study guide, and I'm sure some of the questions there in the study guide shows you some of the most important sections under this. Now, there are also the classic skills for successful change leaders. So these are just few things that you need to understand as the classic skills for successful change leaders, which are turning into the environment, challenging the prevailing organizational wisdom, communicating and compelling aspiration, and building coalition, and so forth. So you might be asked, what is your understanding about building coalition? So one of the examples is when you see political parties in coalition government trying to govern a municipality of some sort and working together to showcase their own uh, skills and management and leadership in terms of improving a specific municipality. Very, very important. So there are also reasons why change may fail. So this can be found in page 74 of your study guide, where you're going to read more about that the issues that change effort may fail because of poor planning, monitoring, and control, because that's a very, very required skill to actually manage change. So you focusing more on the objective than on the steps and processes involved can actually be one of the failures, because people don't want to follow steps that actually provide success because it might be a long process of following those steps. So again, there's also lack of milestone along the way where people fail to monitor progress and they become so reluctant to take corrective action to actually correct some of the wrongs that they've been doing all this time. So that's it for now. And thank you so much for listening. And I believe that you'll be able to understand our sessions over and over. Thank you so much.